You've probably met them, the quiet ones at the office party who leave early, the person in the group chat who reads everything but rarely replies. They're not rude, they're not antisocial, they just never quite feel like they fit. And if you watch closely, you'll notice something else. They're rarely stressed about money, they're not flashy about it, but there's a stability there that doesn't match their modest lifestyle. And here's what nobody talks about. A surprising number of these people end up wealthy. Not Instagram wealthy, not loud wealthy, quietly, steadily, almost invisibly wealthy. The kind of wealth that only becomes visible when someone mentions they own their home outright at 35, or that they're taking a year off to travel, funded entirely by passive income nobody knew they had. There's actual psychology behind this. The same wiring that makes someone feel like an outsider often creates the exact conditions for financial success that most people never develop. And it has nothing to do with intelligence or luck. It's about how a brain that feels socially disconnected processes decisions, time, and risk in fundamentally different ways. Psychologists call it social marginality. It's the persistent feeling of being on the outside looking in. Even when you're technically part of the group, you're in the room, but you feel like you're watching the room. You're at the party, but you're somehow not of the party. These people describe it the same way across cultures and generations, like being separated by invisible glass. You can see everything, you can even participate, but something feels different. Researchers at Stanford studied this phenomenon for over a decade, following hundreds of individuals who scored high on social marginality assessments. They found something unexpected. So people with high social marginality scores, those who consistently felt like outsiders, showed dramatically different financial behaviors than their peers. Not because they tried harder, not because they had better financial education, because their brains processed decisions differently. The neural pathways activated during financial decision-making looked different on brain scans. Areas associated with social reward stayed quiet. Areas associated with pattern recognition and long-term planning lit up instead. The outsider brain develops what psychologists call observer consciousness. When you don't feel embedded in the social fabric around you, you naturally step back and watch patterns. It's not a choice. It's a coping mechanism that becomes a cognitive advantage. You notice things other people miss because they're too busy participating. You see how the game works because you're not playing it the same way everyone else is playing it. You're taking notes while everyone else is performing. This creates an advantage that compounds over time. While most people are optimizing for social approval, making financial decisions based on what their peer group validates, the outsider is optimizing for different metrics entirely. They're not trying to keep up, they're not performing status, they're not even thinking about what looks good to other people. They're just quietly building according to metrics that make sense to them alone. And because those metrics are often more rational, less emotional, less socially driven, they tend to produce better financial outcomes. Take career choices. The person who feels like they belong will often take the job that makes sense to their social circle. The consulting role because that's what their college friends did. The startup because that's what's hot in their city. The nonprofit because that's what people in their community respect. They're navigating by social GPS, using other people's coordinates to determine their own direction. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's how most human decision making works. We're social creatures. We use social proof as a shortcut, but the outsider doesn't have the GPS or trusts it less. They've learned through years of feeling disconnected that following the social script doesn't necessarily lead where it's supposed to lead for them, so they navigate by different landmarks entirely. What actually pays well, not what sounds impressive at a dinner party. What actually builds equity over time, not what generates exciting stories. What actually compounds, not what gets likes on LinkedIn. They take the boring enterprise sales job nobody brags about that pays twice what the sexy startup offers. They become the specialist in an unsexy industry that nobody wants to talk about at parties, but that generates consistent six-figure income. They skip the prestigious, underpaid position for the unknown company with great profit sharing. And 5 years later, while their peers are still optimizing resumes and trying to break into the hot sector, the outsider has a paid-off condo and a brokerage account that's starting to generate meaningful passive income. This pattern shows up everywhere once you know to look for it. Housing markets in Philadelphia and Austin revealed something striking when researchers analyzed buyer behavior over a 15-year period. First-time homebuyers who reported feeling socially disconnected from their peer groups bought properties in neighborhoods an average of 18 months before those neighborhoods gentrified, not because they were smarter about real estate, not because they had better information, because they weren't using social proof as their primary signal for where to buy. They were looking at rent to price ratios, development permits filed with the city, transit projects in planning stages, boring spreadsheet stuff that requires sitting alone with data instead of going to open houses with friends and getting excited about the same neighborhoods everyone else is excited about. Meanwhile, their more socially embedded peers were waiting to see where other people like them were buying, where the cool coffee shops were opening, where their friends were getting good deals. By the time the social proof arrived, by the time the neighborhood was validated by the peer group, the outsiders had already accumulated $300,000 in equity. The same mechanism shows up in investing. Behavioral economists have documented this for years. Social investors, people who talk about their investments and make decisions in community, consistently underperform isolated investors. The isolated investors have no one to perform for, no audience to impress. They just buy index funds and wait. There's a wealth manager in Austin who noticed this pattern in his client base over 20 years of practice. His wealthiest clients, the ones who built 7 and 8 figure portfolios from middle class incomes, from teacher salaries and mid level corporate jobs, shared something unusual. Almost none of them had close friends they discussed money with regularly. They didn't go to wealth building seminars. They didn't join masterminds or money groups. They didn't have accountability partners for financial goals. They just quietly, privately, almost obsessively optimized their financial decisions in isolation. One client, a former librarian, had never told anyone, including her own sister, that she'd accumulated over $2 million in index funds over 30 years. Another, a middle manager at a utility company, retired at 48 with enough passive income to live comfortably for decades, and his colleagues thought he was leaving because he got a better job somewhere else. But here's where it gets deeper, where the psychology becomes almost eerie in how well it predicts financial outcomes. The outsider experience doesn't just change what you do, it changes how you experience time itself. When you feel disconnected from your social environment, you're less anchored to the present moment of that environment. You're not synchronized to the rhythm of your peer group's life stages and milestones. You're simultaneously less invested in current social dynamics and more focused on long-term individual trajectory. Time becomes something you move through differently than the people around you. Psychologists tested this with delayed gratification experiments at the University of Chicago. People who scored high on social marginality measures were significantly more likely to choose larger delayed rewards over smaller immediate ones. In one study, they chose the delayed option at rates nearly 40% higher than socially embedded participants. But here's the interesting twist. This only showed up for decisions they made privately, in isolation. In group settings, they conformed to whatever the group chose. The outside feeling made them long-term optimizers when alone, but it didn't make them contrarians in public. They weren't rebels. They were just operating on a different internal clock. This explains something crucial about quiet wealth that most financial advice completely misses. It's not about being smarter or more disciplined than everyone else. It's not about having some secret strategy or insider knowledge. It's about having a different relationship with social time, with the invisible calendar that governs most people's financial decisions. Most people are synchronized to their peer group's timeline. First house at 30 because that's when your college friends bought houses. Kids at 32 because that's the age your siblings had kids. Promotion at 35 because that's when people at your level typically move up. Vacation in Tulum because everyone's going to Tulum this year and you don't want to miss out. The outsider isn't synchronized the same way. They're running their own clock, operating on their own timeline, so they can do things that look bizarre on the social timeline but make perfect sense on a longer individual timeline. Living in a modest apartment at 40 while sitting on $1 million investment portfolio that generates passive income to retire, driving a 10-year-old car while maxing out retirement accounts. Their choices don't make sense to their peers because their peers are optimizing for a different game. Money is deeply social for most people. It's a language we use to signal belonging, status, shared values. When you buy the same brands as your friends, live in the same neighborhoods, vacation in the same places, you're not just spending money, you're performing membership. You're saying I belong here with you, but if you already feel like you don't belong, that entire incentive structure breaks down. You're not spending money to signal membership in a club that already feels closed to you, so that money goes somewhere else, usually somewhere boring and compounding. There's a reason the outsider rarely talks about building wealth. It's not false modesty, it's that talking about money is inherently a social act, and they're already uncomfortable with social performance, so they optimize silently, they build invisibly, and because they're not broadcasting it, nobody learns from them. The pattern stays hidden. The loneliness is real, though. Every person who fits this pattern describes the same thing. The wealth accumulates, but the disconnection remains. You can't buy your way into feeling like you belong. Some of them eventually make peace with it. Others spend decades trying to reverse engineer the social belonging they see other people experience naturally. Here's what the research suggests: the outsider advantage is real, but it's not a gift, it's a trade. You get clarity because you're not embedded. You get long term thinking because you're not synchronized. You get quiet wealth because you're not performing. But you also get the persistent ache of watching everyone else seem to understand something you don't about how to just be with people. And once you see this pattern, you can't unsee it. The quiet millionaire who still feels uncomfortable at parties. The financially independent person who dreads networking events. The early retiree who has everything except the feeling of being part of something. They got rich quietly, not because they chose to, but because quiet was the only way they knew how to operate. The most interesting question isn't why outsiders get wealthy. It's what they do with that wealth once they have it. Some use it to buy more distance, more control, more insulation from social demands. Others use it to finally build the sense of community they always wanted on their own terms, in their own way, with people who get it. But one thing stays consistent: they rarely announce it, they rarely celebrate it publicly. Because for the person who always felt like they didn't belong, wealth doesn't change the fundamental experience. It just makes it more comfortable. If you recognize yourself in this, you already know what I'm talking about. If you don't, you probably know someone who fits. Either way, the pattern is there, running quietly in the background of modern wealth building, and visible to most people because the people living it don't make noise. Subscribe if you want more deep dives on the psychology behind money and success. Next week, I'm breaking down why people who are bad at small talk often become exceptional negotiators. And if you want to go deeper on the outsider mindset and how it shapes everything from career choices to investment strategy, that video is on screen now.